So good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this third webinar of 2022. I can't believe it's March already. I always find that the first 2 months of the year fly past, and this year is no exception. So I want to get you warmed up straight away. Sorry, I'm multitasking and letting people in at the same time. Please, can you familiarize yourself with the chat box and write in the chat box what you do, where you are. We like to know who's from different countries and what you'd like to learn from tonight's webinar. One of the perks of my job is that there's not many men in the nutrition field. So I tend to get surrounded by very intelligent women, and that's not a bad thing. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce two very insightful and creative and amazing women to you who are going to lead the content tonight for the vegan athlete. Our topic of this night is veganism within sport. We'll also bring in a certain element of vegetarianism because they tend to go side by side quite a lot. And as the editor of FSN magazine, I've seen a big shift over the last few years towards a lot more plant-based orientation by athletes. And that's thanks in part to this documentary we had a couple of years ago called The Game Changers. And that's something Simone and I did a kind of tic-tac-toe kind of webinar in response to. It's a documentary that pseudoscience is too strong a word for the clinical trials they carried out. Having said that, I believe that we can learn something from any scenario, and that's no exception. So we're here today to learn what we can about a vegan or a plant-based context. As will be inferred from Simone's presentation, only a handful of people can really pull the vegan thing off. And whether people become vegan because of ethical reasons or health reasons, our question is, how do we support them as a practitioner? That's what we really need to do. But I also learned a kind of quote from Alex Ferretti a couple of weeks ago, and that is, just because we can, should we? And he was talking about that in the context of a ketogenic diet. The same might be applied to a vegan diet. So I'll kind of tune into that later. So first up tonight is Simone de Carmo. Simone's a nutritionist within sport and exercise. And she's also my colleague at CISN who facilitates all of our students. Simone has flirted with the vegetarian and vegan thing herself and has learned a lot and is very interested in dealing with that kind of client, especially athletes. So she's going to go into a bit of theory behind nutrition for vegan athletes. And then she'll introduce a case study that was an individual that she worked with herself. Simone will then hand the baton over to Rachel, who is a natural chef. And it's an incredibly creative and nutritive way of preparing and sourcing food. Rachel happens to be my wife as well, so I'm a lucky guy for the experiment she does in the kitchen. She's plant-based trained. In other words, she can be incredibly creative with vegetables. And we brought her into this presentation to bring the case study to light. If that was her client, what would she actually do about it? And as we always have, there'll be time later for questions. Simone and Rachel will present. I'll do a bit of a wrap up. I want to just tell you a little bit about the upcoming CISN course, and then we'll open for Q&A, probably the last 15, 20 minutes. So any questions that come up, pop them in the chat box as you're thinking about it. All right, so I'll hand over to you, Simone.
Great, thank you, Ian, for the introduction. So basically, today I'm going to talk you through how I would work with a vegan client. So Ian, if you could put to the next slide, please. Okay, so I think we're all aware of the main reasons why an athlete would adopt a vegan diet. So these three main reasons: the animal welfare, moral values, because of environmental and sustainability reasons, or they may think that a vegan diet will improve their health. Now, all of these topics are basically a webinar in itself, so I'm not going to really delve into these topics. I'll just say that it's not so black and white when it comes to the vegan diets. There's certain things that we need to take into consideration, and I think Ian will touch on that at the end. I just wanted to really highlight this fourth reason, which is basically, and a lot of practitioners might not be aware of it, is that some athletes might adopt a vegan diet as a way to mask disordered eating or potentially an eating disorder. Okay, so as practitioners working in sports, I think it's really important that we look at the warning signs, listen to the warning signs when it comes to an eating disorder, and refer out when necessary. When it comes to disordered eating, though, disordered eating is more on a spectrum. So I've worked with a couple of vegan clients, and they did display some disordered eating behaviors and disordered eating thoughts. But just by educating them and monitoring them over time very carefully, they were able to basically change their behaviors. But again, we need to be mindful of that fine line between disordered eating and eating disorder. Next slide, Ian, please. So that's the first thing, understanding why is a client vegan? Why did they adopt a vegan diet? So the next thing that's really important for me to understand is their timeline. So in other words, their health history. So this is really important with any client, but again, for the vegan clients, if we go through a detailed timeline, we can basically try to see if there's any disordered eating behaviors in the past. Okay, so if you don't know what a timeline is, it's a functional tool, and it's really good to basically organize the client's health history. So first, I would start with the genetic predispositions, and this is basically, so Ian, if you put the next click, please. Yes, the genetic predisposition. So that's basically the family history of the client. And this is really important because if a vegan client comes to me and they say, I'm really low on energy, for example, and let's say that a close relative has a history of anemia, it will give me an indication, okay, there's a genetic factor here, so we might need to consider testing for anemia in this particular client. Then I like to understand the mother's health during pregnancy, as well as the type of delivery and the type of feeding at birth, because we know that C-section babies and bottle-fed babies tend to develop immune issues in later life. Ian, if you do the next clicks, please. So that's during pregnancy and then birth. Okay, so it's really important to consider how they were born. And then we go through basically their childhood, teenage years, and adulthood. And during these years, we're trying to understand, we're trying to look for triggering events, we're trying to look for stress in their life, we're trying to look for, is there any allergens that may be contributing to their current health concerns. But more importantly, their dietary behaviors growing up. What diet did they have growing up, and their dietary thoughts. So what thoughts do they have around food? Again, just to figure out whether there's some disordered eating going on. And then when we get to the current health concerns, I forgot to mention at the beginning that I work mainly with student athletes. Okay, so when they come to me, they usually have, it's usually health related, and it's obviously going to affect their performance because their health is not optimal, so their performance is going to be compromised. So they generally come to me, and 9 out of 10 of the times, most of them will have adopted a vegan diet within 2 years of developing their health issues. So that for me is a big red flag. Okay, so And I had a client before who developed severe gastrointestinal issues 2 months after adopting a vegan diet. So that just tells me again, okay, this vegan diet is probably a major trigger. It's probably not the right diet for them, and maybe a vegetarian approach would be more optimal for them. Or they're probably not doing the vegan diet correctly. Okay. So if you do the next 2 clicks. So yeah, just highlighting the current concerns, and then the star there, just just to mention that the type of clients that I see, they usually develop issues within 2 years of adopting the vegan diet. Okay, for the next slide, we're going to go into the third thing that I think is really important when looking at a vegan diet, and that is doing a very detailed dietary analysis. So what I like to typically do with a vegan diet, with a vegan athlete, is do a 7-day food diary analysis if the budget allows, because it is very time consuming, instead of the typical 3-day dietary analysis that I do. And that's just basically to get a better and accurate estimate of what they're eating. So their caloric, their macronutrient, and the micronutrient intake. I also like to include reflections and symptoms in their food diary to basically assess correlation. So for example, they could eat a meal and let's say 10 minutes later, they start bloating, okay? And let's say they eat that meal again, or they eat some foods within that meal and they get the same symptoms. So that's just, it's a way to basically figure out what are the triggering foods for them. And then pictures of the athletes' meals, basically to compare with what they're recording in the food diary, because their perception can be very different to mine. And also the software that I use does have images with the different amounts of food. So it's really useful, especially if an athlete has recorded their food not in grams. So using, for example, a bowl of cereal, or as an example. So it's really useful to compare pictures with the software. I must highlight though, when it comes to food diary, again, with a disordered eating clients, or potentially a client with an eating disorder, I wouldn't really recommend doing a detailed dietary analysis. Or if you do it, just do it for yourself. And if the athletes, I wouldn't ask them to record their food, because again, it can be triggering for them. Definitely not measuring their food. I would just ask them basically what they would eat in a day, just to get an idea, and then try and support them just by implementing some nutrition principles for that specific client, and see how they get on. But again, if I find that they're on that fine line and it's going towards an eating disorder, I will always refer out, because that's not within my scope of practice. With dietary analysis comes testing. So I think it's really important to test if the budget allows. Again, student athletes, they don't really have much money to spend on testing. But if they can, always recommend, and if they can through their GP, a full panel, blood panel, vitamin D levels, iron levels, and so on. You can also go into functional tests. They're very, very highly valuable. Again, it's not really within my scope of practice. So ideally, I would like to work with someone like Ian. And if I want to implement a functional test, I ask for his opinion and for his interpretation. So it's good to have someone who's also functionally trained if you want to implement some functional testing. Okay, next slide. So this is a recent paper by Shaw et al. It's just a really nice summary of the performance enhancing and performance limiting effects of a plant-based diet on performance. Okay, so typically when athletes adopt a vegan diet, they see improvements in the short term. And that is because there's an increase of fruit and vegetable intake. And that not only improves acid-base levels, but increasing of fruit and vegetable intake is also associated with greater fiber intake. So that contributes to greater and earlier satiety, but also it's higher volume. So they'll feel fuller, and that can lead to weight loss. Also, a vegan diet is naturally high in carbohydrates. So again, we know that carbohydrate fuels performance. So again, might be beneficial in the short term. And then the increased polyphenol and antioxidant consumption can reduce oxidative stress from training, and that will improve their recovery. So again, really good improvements in the short term, but if they're not doing it correctly in the long term, they can run into trouble. So the performance limiting effects, we know that plant-based iron has lower bioavailability compared to animal sources. And obviously iron is really important. It has an oxygen carrying capacity. So if that is reduced, there's no oxygen going to the working muscles, and that will reduce performance. B12, we can't find B12 in plant-based sources except for moderate amounts in nutritional yeast, but it's not enough for an athlete. And so they're really prone to develop a deficiency, and that can reduce performance as well. Plant-based protein, there is an abundance of plant-based protein sources. The problem is that the amino acid profile of plant-based protein is considered to be suboptimal when compared to animal protein. So again, we need to be very mindful when it comes to protein for a vegan athlete, because their needs are greater compared to the average person. I need to consider the amount they're taking in, but also how they're taking it and when they're taking it. Next slide, Ian. So now I'm just basically going to review the nutritional considerations for vegan athletes. So the first one is energy. Okay, so Ian, if you want to do the next click, so there's different pop-ups, and I'm just going to basically review the different nutritional considerations. So the first one is energy. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, I commonly see weight loss in athletes that transition to a vegan diet, and that's because of the high volume nature of plant-based foods, but also the high fiber intake that contributes to greater satiety. And if athletes are not meeting their energy requirements, they can run into trouble. So they can develop immunosuppression, they're at increased risk of developing injuries, and they're an increased risk of developing RED-S, so relative energy deficiency of sport. Okay. Now, so it is really important that a vegan athlete consumes energy-dense foods, plant-based foods. So that is nuts, seeds, olive oil, olives, coconut oil, hummus, and so on. Next one is protein. So as I mentioned before, protein is found in abundance in plant-based foods, but the amino acid profile is considered to be suboptimal when compared to animal-based protein. So for example, we know that grains are deficient in lysine and threonine, and pulses, for example, are deficient in methionine and tryptophan. So when it comes to vegan athletes, they really need to be mindful of combining different protein sources from plant foods. The literature says that as long as they combine it throughout the day, they should be fine in meeting their requirements. I actually think that they should be aiming to mix a variety of plant-based protein sources for each meal. Okay, so each meal should be an opportunity to make the best choice that they can. So they should ideally be mixing plant proteins for each meal to make sure that they're getting all the amino acids that they need. When it comes to older athletes, so we know that with age, our anabolic potential does diminish. So an older athlete will require more protein to get the same anabolic response to someone who is younger. So the typical recommendations that I would suggest for an older athlete that's vegan is to increase their protein intake to 30 grams per meal. They can also supplement with indispensable amino acids, so in particular leucine. So we know leucine is really important for triggering that mTOR pathway, so to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which is essential for recovery and muscle growth. And also really important, they need to blend plant-based proteins to ensure they're getting good quality. Next one is fiber. So fiber, we know that with a vegan diet, athletes should be getting a good amount of fiber, but they should also be conscious of not over-consuming fiber, because it has been linked to basically cause gastrointestinal issues, especially during competition. And also high intakes of fiber, too much fiber, can also impact protein digestibility. Next one is the omega-3s. So we know plant-based diets are typically low in fat compared to an omnivorous diet. And a plant-based diet will provide adequate amounts of omega-6s. The problem is omega-3s. So there's usually an imbalance between omega-6 and omega-3s. And this obviously is linked to inflammation, which is, we don't want inflammation or too much inflammation. So omega-3s, ideally for athletes, I would always recommend a supplement. And there's lots of options on the market nowadays that are based on algae. They can also consume walnuts, linseeds, chia seeds, which provide ALA, which is the short chain omega-3. The problem with that is the conversion from omega-3, the short chain omega-3 to the longer chain omega-3s isn't very efficient. And it will depend on various factors such as the athlete's dietary composition, their health status, their age, and so on. Also, if they're having high intakes of linoleic acid, that can suppress the conversion of ALA. So to maximize that conversion, it is suggested that vegan athletes should take a ratio of 4:1 of linoleic acid to ALA. The next one is phytates and tannins. So these are basically anti-nutritional compounds. So tannins are polyphenolic compounds, and they're found predominantly in grains, pulses, beans, nuts, fruit, and beverages such as coffee and tea. So what basically happens with tannins is they create a complex with proteins, starches, and digestive enzymes, which inhibits the absorption of nutrients in the GI tract, in the gut. Phytates, they basically act as a storage of phosphorus in plant seeds, and they limit the absorption of specific minerals such as calcium, magnesium, and zinc. Next one, so going into the micronutrients now, iron. So I mentioned iron in the previous slide. So we know it's an essential micronutrient. It's involved in oxygen transport, in energy production, in cell proliferation. And we know that plant-based foods have a lower bioavailability of iron compared to iron from animal-based foods, and that can translate into a lower iron status. So athletes are at greater risk of developing iron deficiency, and that's because of the increased inflammation, which reduces iron absorption, also the increased iron losses through sweat, and especially during running, it has been suggested that the repeated foot contact on the ground can damage the red blood cells. Also, women, they are at greater risk of developing iron deficiency, and that's because of menstruation. So although gut adaptations can occur to increase absorption, it is recommended that vegans specifically should increase their iron intake by up to 80%. And it's also important that they pay particular attention to the phytates and the tannins. So again, if they're having a meal, they shouldn't be consuming tea or coffee with the meal, again, because that can reduce the absorption of iron. And ideally, they should have a lot of vitamin C in their diet, because vitamin C helps with the absorption of iron. Next one is calcium and vitamin D. So calcium is probably the most abundant mineral in our body, and it's really important for bone health, for blood clotting, nerve transmission, as well as muscular contraction. Now, there's a common misconception that people that don't consume dairy won't get adequate calcium. But if an athlete has an adequate and well-planned vegan diet, they can get enough calcium through plant-based foods. It has to be well planned though. And also we need to consider that the bioavailability of calcium can be decreased due to phytates, but also oxalate levels. Vitamin D, we know it's a very important vitamin or hormone. There's basically receptors all over the body. So bone health, it's really good for immune function. It's also really good for modulating inflammation, as well as muscle health, musculoskeletal health, and it also acts as an anabolic hormone. So Athletes may be at risk of vitamin D deficiency if they train indoors, if they use a lot of sunblock, if they live at higher altitudes, or if they have more skin pigmentation. So if athletes find it hard to maintain adequate vitamin D levels, for vegan athletes specifically, I would always recommend a supplement. And there are supplements now on the market that are based on an algae fungus called lichen. That's vegan friendly. Next one is iodine. So the research with iodine, it's shown that vegans consume either excessive amounts of iodine or very little amounts. What I typically see is very little. And the iodine content of plant-based foods will depend on the iodine levels of the soil and the farming practices. However, seaweed and sea vegetables are probably the best source that vegans can consume to make sure that they're getting enough iodine. I would be careful with red seaweed because too much of that can actually be quite dangerous. It's too much iodine. So more towards the green seaweed, so like a nori sheet, for example, and using that as a wrap is a good way to make sure that they're getting some iodine in their diet. Potatoes, prunes, cranberries provide moderate amounts of iodine. So as long as a vegan athlete is consuming these foods as well as the seaweed or sea vegetables, then they shouldn't really need iodized table salt. And I prefer a sea salt or a rock salt just from a nutritional perspective. Again, they need to be really careful also with the goitrogenic foods. So your broccoli, your cassava, your cruciferous veg like broccoli, your cassava, your soya, your Brussels sprouts. So we really need to process these foods. So like steaming them, cooking them, fermenting them will reduce that goitrogenic effect, which can impact their iodine status. Next one is zinc. So zinc is really important for many metabolic processes and immune processes as well. It is widely available in plant-based sources, so like pumpkin seeds, oats, nuts, nutritional yeast, and so on. But like iron, it is less bioavailable when compared to animal sources. So to compensate for this, vegans should consume by up to 50% more, while also using methods to reduce phytates and tannins. And then we have vitamin B2 and B12. So all B vitamins are essential for optimal health and performance, but I'll focus on B2 and B12 because these are the ones that can lack on a vegan diet. So B2 is really important for energy metabolism, and it participates also in redox reactions in various metabolic pathways. And it's found predominantly in organ meats and eggs. However, if an athlete has a well-planned vegan diet, they can get sufficient amounts of B2. But again, it needs to be very well planned. And there's also fortified foods, fortified products on the market that include B2. B12, we can only get it from animal sources. So we know that B12 is essential for our nervous system function, DNA synthesis, as well as homocysteine metabolism. So we can only get it from animal sources. We can find marginal amounts in nutritional yeast and also fortified products like fortified milks and cereals. But it's not enough, especially for an athlete who has increased demands for B12. So again, supplements is, I always recommend a B12 supplement. Then to finish, we have creatine and beta-alanine. So creatine is a component of phosphocreatine. So that's a fuel source that we need for very high intensity, short bursts type exercise. So in a normal mixed diet, we get approximately 1 gram of creatine through meat, fish, and then another 1 gram is synthesized endogenously in our liver. So we can't get any creatine from plant-based sources. And with vegan athletes, I find that that most of them can respond quite well to creatine with supplementation. And it's not only beneficial for performance, it's also shown to have beneficial effects for cognitive function as well as for concussion recovery. So it might be really useful for those skill-based sports. For beta-alanine, it's a rate-limiting precursor to carnosine. So beta-alanine is found in meat and poultry, so it's not really consumed by vegans. And although we can synthesize beta-alanine endogenously, individuals who are on plant-based diets have lower muscle carnosine levels compared to those on omnivorous diets because of the reduced beta-alanine intake. So it has been recommended that vegan athletes can experiment with beta-alanine to see if it works for them. Then finally, we have taurine, which is a conditionally indispensable amino acid, and it's concentrated in skeletal muscle. So it is produced endogenously in the liver, but it can also be consumed through eating meat, dairy, seafood. So vegan athletes are actually consuming negligible amounts of taurine. And taurine has really important roles in glucose tolerance, in insulin sensitivity, in substrate uptake, as well as storage. So because of these physiological effects, some researchers actually suggest that vegans might benefit from supplementation. They usually suggest 500 milligrams twice a day. However, this hasn't really been reported yet in the literature. There's a lot of animal-based studies looking at taurine, and it's shown beneficial effects on performance. But also there's some studies looking at taurine for psychiatric disorders and being beneficial. So I wonder if someone who's vegan and then goes onto an omnivorous diet, for example, and if we also consider the link, there's a lot of research looking at veganism and vegetarianism specifically in men, and the link with increased depression, for example, and anxiety. So I wonder if someone adopts an omnivorous diet from a vegan diet, and they normally report feeling better in terms of mental health, whether taurine has an effect here. It would be interesting to actually research that. Okay, next we have a food diary. So Ian said at the beginning it was based on an individual client. I actually changed this because I thought it'd be more interesting to combine different meals from different clients. All of the clients I've seen actually don't really do a bad job on a vegan diet. They've actually been all pretty good. There's obviously some nutritional considerations that they need to optimize. So I thought this would be a nice way to give you an example of how we can basically optimize the diet. Now, before Rachel comes in, so I would work with Rachel. Rachel is a brilliant chef. She takes a diet and she can maximize the nutrient bioavailability of the foods by using different preparation methods. So if we just briefly look at breakfast and lunch, and if you guys can use a chat box and let me know, without doing a dietary analysis, what do you think intuitively is missing in a diet in terms of a nutrient perspective? So if we look at breakfast, we've got some oats, almond or soya milk, cinnamon, peanut butter, banana, or vegan granola and soya milk or oat milk. Then for lunch, we've got the soup with some vegetables, some canned lentils and rice. And this is accompanied with oat cakes or seeded bread with vegan spread. Then next slide, we have dinner, which can be like a vegan curry based with chickpeas. It's got some coconut milk and sweet potato. And then, or the vegan sausages with mash. So the vegan sausages and a mash made with white potato, leeks, and soy cream. And then snacks, just some examples of different snacks. So it doesn't look too bad, right? If we look at this diet, it's actually, for the average person, it wouldn't be, I think the average person wouldn't think it would be too bad. So using the chat box, what do you think is missing in this diet? So I'll just give you 1 minute, and then we'll bring in Rachel, and she can give her ideas of how we can incorporate some other foods and how we can increase the bioavailability of other foods, of other nutrients. Also feel free to unmute and suggest if you don't want to use the chat box. So remember, for breakfast, we had the oats, we had the peanut butter, banana, or cereal, like a granola with a plant-based milk. And then for lunch, we had the lentil-based soup with oat cakes. So from all the nutritional considerations that I reviewed, what do you think is missing? Omega-3s, yes, missing omega-3s. Not enough protein, I agree. Not enough color, I agree. Yes, protein is a big one. Antioxidants, yes. What else? So we've got protein, omega-3s, antioxidants. Also, I must also mention that with vegan athletes, most of them repeat the same meals a lot. So there's not much variety in their meals. Iron, yes. Yep. Okay, let's bring Rachel in. Vitamin D, yes, good. Yep. B12. Okay, so let's bring Rachel in and let's start with breakfast. So previous slide. Okay, Rachel.
Okay, hi there. So what I'm going to do here is I will look at the problems of this diary first before I decide to upgrade to wholeness. So I think to just keep things fairly concise, I'll work with the breakfast version. So if you can just keep this in your mind's eye about the microwaved porridge, as well as the almond or soy milk. And then to bring your attention to the vegan granola. Ian, I'd like to share my screen, so if you could stop sharing. What I have done is, I've simply gone to the internet. It's an amazing place to find out some information. And I'm just going to share here quick and show you what I've done. So all I did was I went to Tesco's online. So you don't even have to go into the store, which is fantastic. And you don't have to stand there and read every ingredient, because this is what we really need to be doing when we do shopping. So I just took an almond milk from Tesco's, and we're lucky enough here to see the ingredients. Let's see if I can get a pen going here. So we're over here at the ingredients piece. And we have a look. So we're looking at almond milk. And our first ingredient is water, and the second ingredient is almonds. But what I want to draw your attention to is the 2% of the almonds. So the way you make almond milk at home is just with water and with almonds. And the way you would prepare it as a milk, you'd prepare it as 1 cup almond to 1 liter of water, which would make that 40% of almonds and the balance water. So this 2% here is a bit of a cheek, because in theory it should be a load more, even though it's the second ingredient. The next problem is this tricalcium phosphate, more stabilizers with locust bean gum and the gellan gum and an emulsifier. And then we've got potassium iodine. Guys, this is a 2-ingredient milk. It's almonds and water. It's dead easy to make. Why would they be putting all this other ingredient in it? The reason they're doing this is to increase the shelf life. So in other words, if you had to make this at home, it would last tops 2 to 3 days in the fridge before it starts going off. And the way you would deal with that is you would portion freeze it and put it in your freezer and remember to take it out the day before. So there's no need for a vegan athlete, for any vegan or vegetarian, to go out and have to source an almond milk. Tricalcium phosphate is, I mean, what is that even? You could just look it up on the internet and see. I just know that the locust bean basically is extracted from carob, which is like a chocolate. I mean, what on earth is this doing in an almond milk? We've got to ask. And all it is a thickening agent. Okay, so if it's a thickening agent, just delete this or decrease the water. You don't need a thickening agent for almond milk. If they're using such a teeny tiny amount of almonds to so much water, they wouldn't need this. They wouldn't need this. There'd be no point. So if they, to make an almond cream, for example, you would use maybe 1 part nuts to 2 parts of water to make it thicker. That's how you make it, by using nuts and less water. And now they've just gone and added thickening agent completely unnecessarily. The gellan gum is basically a food additive as well. It's used to bind and stabilize the milk. If you have a look at this, I looked up this potassium iodide. And if we look here, let me just get out of the annotation quick, clear this. If you look, mouse, there we go, over here, it gives you, this is just looking on Wikipedia, and it tells you what it is. It's a chemical compound medication and dietary supplement. As a medication, it's used to treat hyperthyroidism in radiation emergencies and to protect the thyroid gland with certain types of radiopharmaceuticals. Come on, this is milk. I mean, this is an almond milk. This is almonds and water. That's all it is. That's all this shows. It doesn't, we don't need these extra ingredients. The same goes with the soy. The soy milk is exactly the same. It's not a huge process. You make soy milk when you make tofu. So it's the first process before you process tofu. And here you've got 8% of the soybeans, with the third ingredient being sugar. Acidity regulators is the 4th one. Calcium carbonate, flavoring, more gum stabilizers, more potassium iodide. This is absolutely unnecessary to put in a diet. This can absolutely be made themselves. And when you're on such a restricted diet, I highly recommend that athletes and humans, even non-athletes, make their own kinds of milks. Going to the vegan granola, I just picked one because it's actually said no added sugar. And these are my favorites. They're absolutely my favorite when they say no added sugar, because then you find ways where they do add the sugar, which is really cool. So if we scroll down here, so this is a cashew, almond, coconut one. So if I looked at this just straight away, I think, oh, good, it's got some nuts in it. It's going to be full of protein. So that's something that will work for me. But let's look at the ingredients here. It's got, the first amount is the cereals. And then they've added some flours, a combination of 2 flours to bulk up the 67% of the cereals. And then here we go. If you look here, annotate. If we look over here, I'll just highlight it here. There's the sugar, date paste. Here's the sugar, banana puree. And to just trick you one more time, here's the sugar, barley malt extract. Don't tell me this is no sugar added. They've added all the sugar for you. So, you know, it's just clever marketing. Would this be good enough for an athlete as far as the protein content goes? My answer would be no. I think the nuts, 5% of nuts in this whole granola, they would certainly have to add their own nuts into this to increase their portion of granola. And if you could go back to the diary. So how I would upgrade the diary is, if you have a look at everything in the beginning was microwaved, which means they're probably using those, either the 2-minute oats or a highly refined oat. What this means is, it means that the grain has been so overly processed that it's basically been stripped of most of its fat, most of its fiber, most of its protein, and a lot of its carbohydrates. So they have to synthesize it by adding fortified whatevers into the oats. The only thing it does is it makes it cook really quickly, but it leaves the person feeling hungry an hour later. So how I would upgrade this is, I would take it, obviously the optimal will be an oat groat. So you would soak that and cook it well the next day. You could even put it in a slow cooker and just let it go. The next best option would be the pinhead oat or the steel cut oat. Again, all it is just literally the oat grain just being chopped. So we're looking for food that has the minimal amount of human intervention. And the more natural it is, the more nutritionally dense it is, and the more energetic potential it can give to both the athlete, well, to the athlete basically. And then the third best bet and would be the lowest grade that I would go would be a rolled oat. And that is, it's basically steamed and flattened, so it's applied heat to it. And that would be my absolute minimum for a client, and particularly an athlete where their bodies are hankering for nutrients, particularly on a restricted diet. I would highly recommend that they made their own milk. And because one of the things that Simone pointed out was they eat the same things over and over and over again, this is where I would play with different grains. I mean, we've got access to quinoa and teff and amaranth and buckwheat and millet. I mean, there's heaps of grains that they can play with now that we've got access to very easily from anywhere. And so I would play with variety in the grain department, and I would play with variety in the milk department, and use both nut milks and seed milks, and even grain milks like an oat milk or a rice milk. So there's a lot of different opportunities to get access to different nutrients by using different products. To stay close to center, I would have suggested that they use an almond nut butter as opposed to a peanut butter. From a digestive point of view, I find, and we found in our clinic, that if we match the nuts, the digestibility and the ease and the ability to assimilate is, and the comfort is better when we keep with the same nut. And then the banana is absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be a banana. I mean, you could get a really high grade maple syrup, and coconut nectar is lovely as well. And these are minimally processed and decent sweeteners. But yes, I would. Rolled oats doesn't work well in the microwave. The radiation doesn't resonate with it. It works better as a soaked and then a cooked, which we call steeped porridge. With regards to the granola, I would try a specialty store or an organic market or something like that, where they're using decent oils, like a nice coconut oil, where you've got a higher base of nuts. And remember, there's always the opportunity of making this yourself. There you have full control of both variety and what goes into the granola. We don't ever buy granola. I always make it, and there's always something different, whether it's a dried fruit, whether I'm using different nuts, whether I'm adding a different kind of grain or a sweetener. I even sometimes combine an actual pureed fruit into the granola to give it a completely different flavor, like banana, for example. There's loads of superfoods you can add to that just to zhuzh it up more. But my look at this would tell me that this athlete is deprived in the protein side of things. I would say that this diet from breakfast to dinner is insufficient in the protein. And how I'd pick that up as well is, instead of having the oat cakes or the seeded bread, I would go for a high protein smoothie. If you decide not to do that, I would think about adding maybe a pea, hemp, or rice protein powder into the porridge, just to zhuzh up the protein a bit more as well. But to do a nice wholesome smoothie using a beautiful coconut kefir base and adding your protein powders and nuts, and you can even add grain to that smoothie to amp it up and make it more filling, more nutritious, and help with the sustainability of that athlete to get through this. So we saw that the athlete had a porridge for breakfast, which is wet. They had a soup for lunch, which is again wet. And they had a curry for dinner, which is a wet food as well. If the athlete had to eat this way, they would get they would have an issue with everything being almost, it just being wet. So how would I have changed this? I would maybe have taken, they had a chickpea curry. I would have taken those chickpeas and turned them into falafels. So I wouldn't have used the can. It's much faster. You just you would soak those chickpeas in water and then work with them straight away rather than cooking them. And then they've got something they can bite into, something dry, something crunchy. This food diary lacks texture. I mean, it just screams sloppiness, it's just too soft, too wet. I would want something to crunch, and as humans, we need this. So, that's the way I would look at doing it. I would think about also using things like tofu and tempeh. And if you want to upgrade on the tofu, I would look at a sprouted tofu, a sprouted organic tofu, and do the tempeh as well. Now, do I think, and have we witnessed athletes thriving on a vegan diet? I personally have not seen any thrive on a vegan diet. I've seen vegetarian, but not quite vegan. And I think the reason that this is not happening is because vegan diets are very, very specific to the individual. In other words, some people get great energy from vegetables and thrive, and they're driven, and they feel vital and amazing. And then you get people that get their energy from meat. And then you get those people that thrive on the vegetables, but then the meat takes the energy away. So it drops their energy. It makes them heavy and sluggish. So we really want to, it's those kind of people that are the better ones to go vegan. That being said, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that vegan athlete train themselves in some form of cooking. So we often, I teach at the School of Natural Cookery in Colorado, and 98% of the students that we see are vegan or vegetarian. And I think one of the biggest reasons they come to see us is because they themselves are tired of food. And why are they tired of food? Because they're eating the same stuff over and over again. And they're not thinking variety, they're not thinking texture, they're not thinking color, they're probably lacking in the nutrients. If the person can train themselves and do some form of proper, they can understand how to make gluten in their own kitchen, you know, how to turn gluten into seitan, how to treat every vegetable and protein on its own with a unique cooking method, how to upgrade to wholeness with figuring out the refinement process and how to process as a cook versus using the processed refined foods from the store, then they have so much of a better chance of being able to be the vegan athlete. But if I go to Morrison's, for example, and I have a look at the vegan meals, and Morrison's is seen as a fairly decent store, or I consider it, because I get decent organic produce from there when I need to, you know, use more than our box. But those vegan meals, the first ingredient is soy concentrate. Now, it doesn't say non-genetically modified soy concentrate. It just says soy concentrate, which is more than likely supporting genetically modified crops. Now, is this what we really want to do? So it's going to depend on where the athlete's head is at. You know, what is their motive? Like Simone brought up in the beginning, is it an eating disorder? Is it environmental? Is it animals? You know, you need to ask themselves, if it's environmental, well, they're supporting the, you want to go with non-genetically modified soy. The amount of soy in their diet is huge. Now, if the vegan athlete had an issue with soy as an allergen and they had an issue with wheat, then this diet is not for them, because it leaves them with hardly anything to eat. It really does. It puts the restrictions even further. And again, if the athlete is got massive gut issues, or they've come out in eczema, or they've got hives, or they're farting from here to who knows where, whatever the case is, that means that there's a problem with the food, and there's a problem with their eating routine, and they have a duty to themselves, and they owe it to themselves to make small changes. So you can consider, if they need to. This is intuitive eating. This is what I teach. This is where we need to get to a place to. So yes, Ian's a functionally trained NT, and he may say to you, make your own almond milk, but you have a reaction to the skin of the almond. But he doesn't know that, for example. You don't go with what Ian says is right. You go with what your body says is right, because nobody can tell you what's right other than your own body. And that's intuition. So it's everything you eat. If your body reacts negatively, you know that thing you need to park. if the vegan athlete, we were initially discussing a runner, and we were going to talk about his diet. He had intense gut issues. It wasn't the minute he started, it progressed. So into the first month, he started having problems, and then it started getting worse, and then it started getting worse. This means that this is not right for you, and you need to make changes. And we owe that to ourselves. And if you want to be good, then you need to respond to what your body says. So I tried to be a vegetarian, not even a vegan. And when I was in my triathlon days, I was the background of being a national triathlete, and I was highly competitive. And because why vegan or vegetarian is because it appears to be so healthy. So what did I do? I went on a vegetarian diet, and I made, I ate lots of foods high in, I did exactly what vegetarians should do. And then I bombed. And if anybody knows me, I'm like a supercharged, hyperactive bunny who should have probably been put on Ritalin, but in those days when I was at school, there was no name for my hyperactivity, and I channeled it through sport. So I don't bomb. And that's what started happening to me. And it was my duty. If I wanted to get further enough and I wanted to make it to worlds, it means I had to put that vegetarian idea on the side and go the ethical route. So this is what we need to do. And the big problem we're finding with vegetarians is they start including TVP into their diet. What is TVP? It's textured vegetable protein. So you get conned by thinking it's vegetables, but again, it's soy. And what is it? It's soy flour. This is how you get textured vegetable protein. They take the soy flour and then they use solvents and chemicals to extract the fat. And then you get a high protein and low fat TVP, which is the soy concentrate. This is not healthy. This isn't even food. This is food like food. It's pretending to be food. It's not food. It's been so synthesized and so stripped of what a soybean should be that it is no longer a decent, assimilable, nutritive thing for the body. And this is what the sausages are made of, the burgers, the meatballs, you name it, is full of this TVP, or it is called soy concentrate. So you really need to be mindful, of how much of this you want to have in your diet. Energetically, it's got nothing, it's dead because it's so synthesized. I think if you had to eat TVP on its own, it would taste revolting. And that's why they have to fortify it and add a whole load of other synthesized things and mix it in and add some sweeteners in order to give it some taste. So for a vegan athlete, my suggestion is they do some serious training if this is the way they're going to take it. They educate themselves thoroughly. They know where they're going. They know how to prep things from scratch. They're working with an NT. They do the dietary analysis to see where the shortfalls are, and they will thrive. But if they do not do that, I don't see much hope. I think, Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Rach. You finished on a high point there. So what I want to do is just, I was going to wrap up there, but I think Rach did an excellent job. The key thing for a vegan athlete, especially, but also a vegetarian athlete, is that word education. So yeah, let's eat in the right way for my body and tune in. That's a key thing. So Rachel's trained in this intuitive eating, cooking, and that means connection to your own body. But we're in this era of, okay, I'm following this diet or that diet, and it's from a magazine or a book or a celebrity or a podcast. Or it could be a very highly qualified nutritional therapist, functional medicine practitioner, dietitian who's suggested they eat this particular way. But as Rachel said, I've got plenty of experience, but I don't know if you're going to be farting after that lunch tomorrow or not. So you have to tune in and become very, very mindful. That's a key consideration. And then also be very mindful why you're choosing to eat a certain way. Is it working for you? And what's the cost? So I had a couple of slides. This is just on protein. and this is a handout I give to clients. So what do you need to eat to get 20 grams of protein? And if it's an animal-based thing, which is on the left-hand side here, it's not very much. It's a very, very small chicken breast, for example, or 3 eggs. On the right-hand side, you've got plant-based sources, and you're looking at much bigger quantities. So like for tofu, for example, 250 grams to get 20 grams of protein. I mean, that's a decent size of slab. And then we've got this biological value of protein, something we use to measure how good is the protein source. This is quite an old one. There's a couple of newer ones now, but they're not too dissimilar in quantity, and this is a simpler one to look at. So, the animal proteins are much higher biological availability. We got a question earlier about protein powders. So yes, when we analyze it, the wheys are still much more biologically available to the body for most people. And here's soybeans down here. We don't have tofu. Tofu might be a little bit better because it's been processed. But in theory, that's saying, okay, you need 2 lots of soya or tofu to get the same amount of protein as, say, some chicken or egg. That's an awful lot of vegetarian source of protein to achieve that. So I've been in practice a long, long time, and I don't experience that. I don't experience a vegan athlete who's eating enormous amounts of beans to get their protein. Most of them, I agree with Rich, don't do so well, and they'll be more healthy in a vegetarian approach. But you get the odd outlier. So outlier is a scientific term saying, okay, if you're not part of the usual crowd, somebody who does really well on a keto diet is an outlier. Somebody who does really well on a vegan diet is an outlier from my clinical experience. So if you're that outlier, I would postulate that the science hasn't been done to explain this yet. You're going to be able to extract a lot more protein out of these plant-based sources of food than the typical omnivorous eater. Just like Rachel said, vegetables will make some people feel really good, whereas other people need a bit of protein to ground them. So just a bit of a philosophical question. I don't like to just get stuck by the science, because the science cannot explain everything that we see as practitioners. So that's where the mindfulness comes in. Okay, just before we round up and go to questions, I want to just tell you that we've just launched the June intake for the Certificate of Integrative Sports Nutrition course. So that will start early June. We've had a lull, I have to be honest. COVID has created a lull, but we've had lots of good inquiries coming into this year. So I think the energy's shifting. So we're looking for a good intake to make the deal a little bit sweeter. Oh, sorry, this is the process. We're going through integrative nutrition, this sort of functional model in sports, through a module that's focused on performance nutrition, but in a very applied way, with that open mind that we try and incorporate, and then into a specialized sports nutrition module. So this is all available on our website if you want to have a look. Here's the prices normally. So 2,300 for the certificate course. If we add in Rachel's cookery course, it's 2,900. I'm a Scotsman. A top value of mine is value for money. So it is, I think you'll ask any of our students, and it is very good value for money. We pack in a lot. There's discounts for BANT, BASES members and students, but also we've got this early bird price to knock a couple of £100 off as well. So that ends in March, which will be 2 months prior to the course starting. So I just wanted to let you know, because by the time we do a webinar again, we'll be in April. So any interest, if you've been thinking about it, yeah, I'm feeling the energy shifting this year. So let's come and have a good group of students this June. Okay, and there's a contact page for us. Okay, so let's go to the questions. And the first one was, it was about the vegan protein powders. So, yeah, it's going back a little bit. But Simone, you had said that the vegan protein powders weren't as biologically available or words to that effect. And we got a question through about that. Can you just maybe add to that and put it into context? I think you did to some point with mixing the protein powders and so on.
Yeah, so basically what I said was plant-based protein is considered to be suboptimal compared to animal-based protein. And that's because of the amino acid profile. So for example, grains, they will be deficient in lysine, the amino acid lysine, and threonine. So it is really important that we combine, for example, a grain with a nut, for example, so we can get a complete amino acid profile. Does that make sense? Whoever asked the question?
Yeah, just type through if you want any extension on that. I've got a chart, I'm sure you do as well, Simone, of protein combining, you know, like
yeah.
dal and rice is a nice combination, for example,
yeah.
or
and
beans on toast.
And vegans will naturally do it. They won't eat beans by themselves. They'll combine it with toast, for example. But when it comes to protein supplements, protein powders, I would always recommend a blend, and not just a hemp protein or a rice protein. Having a blend, then we get the complete amino acid profile instead of just one specific isolated plant-based protein.
Thank you. We also had a question about the timing of consumption of different nutrients before or during or after exercise within a context of veganism. So when would be best to consume which nutrients to benefit athletes, and when or what to avoid to prevent negative impacts such as GI distress? So
that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think the principles still apply. The sports nutrition principles still apply for a vegan approach. So again, you want to focus on protein. Again, protein it does depend. Obviously, protein is for recovery, but it does depend. Like when you have it, it does depend if you had something before the session or even during the session. So yeah, it does depend on the context. For carbohydrate, we know it fuels performance, so we want to make sure that we consume, and plant-based foods are naturally high in carbohydrates, so there's no problem there. For protein, again, I would focus on making sure that you get enough, especially after a session, to make sure that you are supporting that mTOR pathway. But having something a bit before the session will also make sure that you have some amino acids in the system. So again, you can delay that post-exercise feeding. And then just generally having lots of antioxidants in your diet overall will just support recovery by reducing oxidative stress. Does that answer your question? I don't think there's like anything specific for veganism, if that makes sense. I think the same principles for any dietary approach still applies in terms of the nutrients.
And we teach nutrient timing we do a whole session on nutrient timing in the course, just a little plug there. So yeah, I mean, like Rachel mentioned, a yummy smoothie. You can do a plant-based yummy smoothie with a coconut kefir or something like that in there. I had a question about vegan collagen. Have you heard of such a thing, either of you?
Yeah, I think you can get vegan collagen from genetically modified yeast and bacteria, but I've never experimented with it. Yeah, it's not something I'm familiar with. It's something actually quite new, but I know it's considered it's vegan collagen now.
Okay, thank you. Right, any other questions, anyone, before we we tie up for this evening. And you're welcome to send me an email or Simone an email, and we'll answer your question as well as possible. And we're also very open to suggestions. Okay, you're all lovely. Thank you. Thank you. We'll do a thumbs up. Smiley face. Thank you. So I think, yeah, we can tie it up now. I want to thank you, Simone. That was a really nice presentation, quite scientific on if you're going to be a vegan diet, these are the things you need to be aware of, and you need to be very educated. I would argue that any athlete who wants to be the best athlete needs to be highly educated within their nutritional strategies and keep learning, tap into practitioners who really know their stuff. But it's especially important with vegan athletes because it's such a high risk of missing out nutrients. And as someone said, athletes put their bodies under so much more demand than lay people who are surfing on the sofa at night rather than out doing a time trial or something like that. So it's really, really important. And then learn to cook. It's a basic, but when we're in this sports nutrition paradigm that we're still unfortunately sitting in of calories, carbs, proteins, and fats, we miss the point, we miss the nourishment, we miss the colors, the diversity, and the connection with food. We need to go back in time to create that connection. So I want to thank you all for coming on and spending an hour with us, over an hour with us. And we look forward to seeing you next month. And we've got, Simone talked about Red S. So we've got an expert in Red S, relative energy deficiency in sports next month. So please join us. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.